What kind of curse can take a Habsburg prince, born in one of the richest courts in Europe, and leave him dying at 34 with nothing but an empty wine bottle beside his bed? Archduke Ferdinand Charles of Austria entered the world with every advantage a man could desire. Heir to power, wrapped in velvet, surrounded by marble halls and the endless rituals of dynasty, his life was meant to shine as proof of Habsburg strength. Yet instead of being remembered as a ruler, his story ends as a warning. Behind the grandeur of processions and the echo of choirs, there was a silent descent, a slow unraveling. A man losing himself to the bottle while history turned its gaze away. Picture his last nights. The chamber that once glowed with light and music is now dark. A single candle flickers against the walls. His hands, once steady enough to hold the weight of a court, tremble violently as the drink devours his body. The veins in his arms ache, his breath comes in gasps, and the palace air smells of spilled wine and decay. No courtiers kneel at his bedside, no priest whispers blessings, no family gathers to hold his hand. Only a young Habsburg prince, stripped of titles and dignity, waiting for death in silence. This is the image history has preserved, not the grandeur of coronations, but the ruin of indulgence, not a triumphal procession, but a lonely death surrounded by emptiness. His tragedy forces us to ask, how does power turn into prison, and privilege into poison? Stay with us as we follow the rise and fall of Archduke Ferdinand Charles of Austria, a prince destroyed not by enemies, but by his own hand. And if you wish to uncover more forgotten stories buried in blood and silence, watch until the very end and subscribe to this channel for more. Ferdinand Charles of Austria was born in 1628 into the House of Habsburg, one of the most powerful dynasties in Europe. His very birth was a political act, a continuation of the dynasty's long struggle to preserve dominance over the fractured territories of the Holy Roman Empire. His father, Leopold V, was Archduke of Further Austria and ruler of Tyrol, a man bound by duty and dynasty. His mother, Claudia de' Medici, came from the influential Florentine family whose wealth and refinement carried a legacy of intrigue and survival. From the cradle, Ferdinand Charles was not merely a child, but a symbol, proof that two great bloodlines could fuse to secure both political strength and cultural prestige. The walls of Innsbruck's Hofburg Palace were his first world. Marble floors, candlelit chapels, and the echo of soldiers' boots in endless courtyards defined his earliest memories. While other children stumbled barefoot on earth, he was guided by tutors, priests, and courtiers, each shaping him into something larger than himself, an heir, a future ruler, a vessel for Habsburg continuity. Every gesture he made in childhood was observed, weighed, and compared. Even his laughter had to be tempered with the solemnity expected of a boy destined to rule. Ceremony surrounded him like a second skin. His education was steeped in religion, politics, and languages, crafted not to free his imagination, but to bind him more tightly to the obligations of his house. He was taught that his life did not belong to him, that every decision would be scrutinized, not for personal joy, but for dynastic survival. Behind the tutor's lessons lay an invisible cage, a gilded structure as confining as iron. As a child, he watched his father struggle with the pressures of rule and die while Ferdinand Charles was still young. That loss cast a shadow over his early years. His mother, Claudia, ruled as regent until he came of age, guiding his education and preparing him for the mantle of authority. Yet even under her care, the expectations pressed harder. He was no ordinary boy. He was the fragile thread by which Tyrol and further Austria held their connection to the Habsburg crown. Any mistake, any sign of weakness, would ripple through the court and raise whispers of vulnerability. The rituals of dynasty promised splendor, but they also created isolation. Surrounded by advisors and attendants, Ferdinand Charles lived in a world where affection was measured in duty. Every companion he had was carefully chosen. Friendships were formal, conversations rehearsed, and each glance was filtered through the lens of politics. His world was rich with jewels and tapestries, yet poor in warmth. The tragedy of his early years lay not in poverty or violence, but in suffocation. To the outside world, his childhood glittered with privilege. To him, it was a performance staged in endless corridors, a pageant in which he could never step out of character. Even moments of play were overshadowed by the ever-present reminder of what he would become. The boy who ran through the halls of Innsbruck was already expected to embody the weight of centuries. It is here that the seeds of his downfall began to grow. The constant ceremonies, the endless expectations, the absence of genuine intimacy formed a silent pressure. He was not taught how to be a man, but how to be a symbol. And symbols cannot bend. They cannot falter. Yet Ferdinand Charles was human, and behind the mask of the Habsburg heir was a boy who carried loneliness like a secret wound. As he moved toward adulthood, the rituals would give way to responsibility, and the weight of empire would shift entirely onto his shoulders. The promise of power would soon reveal itself not as freedom, but as another chain. When Ferdinand Charles came of age, the careful guardianship of his mother Claudia ended, and the weight of rule passed to him. The young Archduke stepped into his inheritance as ruler of Tyrol and further Austria, a strategically vital territory that linked the Habsburg crown lands and provided immense revenues from trade routes and silver mines. The boy raised in ceremony now found himself the master of a court, the face of Habsburg authority in a region that looked to him for strength and stability. The transition from regency to independence was marked by ritual. The halls of Innsbruck glowed with processions, choirs, and banquets that celebrated the moment. Nobles gathered from across the territory to swear allegiance, and the young Archduke, dressed in silks embroidered with gold thread, sat upon a throne that seemed almost too large for his age. For the first time, the mask of ritual was no longer practice. It was reality. He was not merely the heir anymore. He was the ruler. Dynastic politics shaped his every step. The Habsburgs, always concerned with alliances, positioned Ferdinand Charles carefully within the web of European marriages. His union with Anna de' Medici, his cousin and the last heir of her branch of the family, was meant to secure wealth and maintain the close ties between Austria and Tuscany. To the court, the marriage was a triumph of strategy. To Ferdinand Charles, it was another obligation, another reminder that his life was not his own. The Medici bride brought elegance and refinement to Innsbruck, filling the court with Florentine artists and musicians. Yet even in this alliance, whispers followed the union produced no surviving children, and the question of legacy began to weigh on him. The court of Tyrol under his rule flourished in appearance. Innsbruck became a center of magnificence, a place where musicians, painters, and architects were summoned to display the wealth of the Archduke. The banquets were dazzling, the festivals extravagant, and the palace glittered with jewels and silver chalices. Visitors described a court alive with splendor, a jewel of the Alps where Habsburg authority was mirrored in feasts and parades. But behind the spectacle was a quieter truth. The court that sparkled in daylight often drowned itself in indulgence at night. Wine flowed as freely as the music. Feasts stretched into dawn. What began as celebration soon became habit, and what became habit soon hardened into dependence. For Ferdinand Charles, the presence of wine at every banquet blurred the line between ritual and necessity. The cup raised in toast to dynastic pride became the cup that numbed his isolation. The grandeur of Innsbruck was also its trap. The silver mines filled the coffers, but they also funded excess. Each triumph of art or music required more festivals, more drinking, more display. The nobles who surrounded him measured loyalty not only in council, but in how deeply they could drink with their prince. The palace that had once symbolized his authority became the very place where his weakness was fed. And so the young Archduke's rise contained the seeds of his fall. He held power. Yet power did not give him freedom. He possessed wealth, yet wealth gave him temptations that whispered to his most fragile instincts. He stood at the height of ceremony, but ceremony could not soothe the loneliness that still lingered from his youth. As the celebrations of his early rule faded into routine, the indulgence remained. The wine cups that once marked joy began to mark escape, and as years passed, the image of a radiant young ruler began to blur into something else. A man who carried the weight of dynasty in public, and the weight of his own despair in private. The promise of Ferdinand Charles's early rule soon gave way to shadows. Within the vast Habsburg dynasty, unity was rarely simple. Branches of the family watched each other with suspicion, measuring loyalty against ambition. To the imperial court in Vienna, the Archduke of Tyrol was expected to act with dignity, to embody stability. But reports began to reach the capital that painted a different picture. Whispers of excess, of nights spent in drink rather than in council, began to tarnish his image. At first, these stories were dismissed as exaggerations. Nobles in Innsbruck had long lived amid festivals and wine. Yet repetition carries weight, and soon the murmurs grew louder. Envoys returned to Vienna describing a ruler too often distracted, his decisions clouded, his judgment softened by indulgence. For a dynasty that measured its power in discipline and ceremony, the idea of a prince losing control was more dangerous than open rebellion. It signaled weakness, and weakness could not be tolerated. Inside his own court, the distance grew. Advisors who once pressed close with flattery began to keep their words measured. Some excused themselves from late banquets, unwilling to be drawn into the haze of drink that clouded the palace. Others wrote cautious letters to Vienna, shifting blame should the Archduke's reputation collapse entirely. Even those who remained loyal grew quiet, powerless to pull him back from the spiral. The court, once a place of music and laughter, became colder. Festivities lost their brilliance, and eyes followed him with unease rather than admiration. Servants carried trays of wine not only because he demanded it, but because silence seemed safer than resistance. To deny him his cup was to provoke anger, and so the ritual continued, feeding both his body and the rumors that spread beyond the palace walls. Family ties, too, grew strained. The Habsburgs prided themselves on order and legacy, yet in Ferdinand Charles they saw a mirror of fragility. His lack of heirs, the consequence of his childless marriage, deepened the concern. The dynasty thrives on succession, and without children, his branch seemed doomed to fade. Relatives looked upon him not as a pillar of the house, but as a liability. Where warmth might have saved him, there was only formality, cold letters, and distance. The more isolated he became, the more he turned inward, Wine dulled the whispers, but it also thickened the wall around him. Nights once filled with counsel now ended in silence. His closest companions, the servants who refilled his glass. Even among courtiers, his authority weakened. Decisions were delayed, documents unsigned, and the machinery of government began to slow. Tyrol, a land that once trusted the strength of its Archduke, started to sense the fragility behind the curtain. And in Vienna, the whispers became strategy. If Ferdinand Charles could not command respect, then the dynasty must protect itself from his decline. Envoys were sent with stricter oversight, instructions were tightened, and his independence as a ruler shrank. The freedom of his early years narrowed into a cage of suspicion. Where once he had been celebrated with festivals, now he was watched, judged, and quietly abandoned by those who should have been his allies. This was the cruelest part of his descent. The loneliness born not of physical exile, but of standing in a crowded palace and feeling utterly alone. Every smile masked judgment. Every silence carried disapproval. The dynasty that had lifted him to power now seemed to hold him at arm's length, unwilling to claim him fully, yet unable to disown him without shame. As his isolation deepened, the palace itself seemed to grow darker. The banquets that remained were fewer, quieter, stripped of the joy they once held. What lingered instead was suspicion, the weight of eyes, and the knowledge that he had become a ruler no longer trusted by his own family, nor respected by his own court. By the time Ferdinand Charles entered his early 30s, the signs of his decline were impossible to hide. What had once been whispers about indulgence became visible in every movement he made. His hands, once steady in ceremony, now trembled uncontrollably. Courtiers noticed how he gripped goblets with both hands, as though afraid that the weight of the wine itself might betray him. His steps faltered in the corridors of Innsbruck, and his speech, at times, dissolved into slurred fragments that left his advisors exchanging uneasy glances. The palace, once alive with music, echoed instead with the sounds of illness. At night, attendants heard him call out in confusion, his voice breaking through the silence with cries that bordered on delirium. The corridors carried the sound of coughing that shook his body until blood stained the linen at his bedside. The air of the chambers grew heavy with the sour odor of wine mixed with sickness, a reminder that the grandeur of marble walls could not conceal the decay of the man within. His body bore the punishment of years of excess. The constant drinking had begun to ravage his liver, leaving his skin sallow. His eyes yellowed with jaundice. Physicians summoned in secrecy whispered of cirrhosis, though they wrapped their words in the language of humors and imbalance. No cure seemed to ease his pain. Treatments of herbs and prayers dissolved into futility, while the Archduke himself demanded more drink, even as it corroded the organ that sustained him. With each passing month, the decline grew sharper. He suffered sudden fits of panic, moments when he clawed at the sheets as though unseen figures haunted him. Servants described nights of terror, when he cried out names from his past or begged for mercy from shadows only he could see. The walls of Innsbruck, once witness to celebrations, now heard groans, retching, and the guttural sounds of a body tearing itself apart. The Archduke's physical torment mirrored his mental disintegration. He drifted between lucidity and confusion, between brief moments of recognition and long stretches of delirium. Days passed when he could barely rise from his bed. Meals went untouched, replaced by the steady demand for wine that no servant dared deny. The ritual of drink, once masked by the excuse of celebration, had become the core of his existence. He no longer drank to join others. but to silence himself, to numb the agony that crept through his veins. In these final years, Innsbruck resembled less a seat of power and more a prison of slow death. Courtiers no longer sought his presence for counsel, but watched from a distance as his body wasted away. The Archduke, who had once paraded through halls in robes of velvet, now lay shivering under blankets, his frame thin, his hands shaking, his breath shallow. His decline was not sudden, not the clean strike of a sword or the swift blow of fate. It was prolonged, a death by inches, a punishment stretched across time. To watch him in those days was to witness the image of a man trapped within his own body, consumed not by external enemies, but by the slow betrayal of his flesh. Each gasp of breath, each drop of blood coughed onto white sheets, marked the erosion of both ruler and man. The grandeur of dynasty meant nothing in those hours. What remained was only suffering, drawn out like a cruel ritual, as if each night were another act in a play of torment that had no end. The last nights of Archduke Ferdinand Charles were not marked by the noise of triumph, but by an unsettling quiet. Innsbruck's palace, once filled with the laughter of courtiers and the thunder of celebrations, stood still. Its vast corridors lay empty, the echoes of footsteps fading quickly into silence, as if even the building itself recoiled from what was happening inside. In his private chambers, light came only from a cluster of candles that bent in the draught, their flames thin and fragile. The furniture, carved with the grandeur of Habsburg pride, seemed to mock the man who now lay surrounded by shadows. Bottles stood in corners, some drained to the last drop, others abandoned halfway, their contents stale, the smell of wax and sour wine mixed in the heavy air. The court that had once rushed to please him now lingered at a distance. Servants entered quietly, placing pitchers and cloths at his side, and retreated without words. Advisors, priests, even family, did not come. There were no prayers read, no blessings murmured, no vigil to soften the path between life and death. The rituals that had defined his existence deserted him at the moment he needed them most. He was left not as a ruler, but as a man, alone with the silence. On a small table near his bed stood a silver goblet. He reached for it with hands that no longer carried authority, only desperation. The wine that remained was not sweet, but bitter, yet he held it close, pressing the rim to his lips as though it could restore what years had stolen. The candlelight caught the metal, glinting for a moment, before the vessel trembled in his grasp. He clutched it as if it were the last tether to his identity, a reminder that he had once been celebrated in feasts, once been honored in toasts, once been more than the shadow he had become. The chamber grew colder as the night deepened. Outside, the city of Innsbruck slept unaware that its prince was facing the end. No bells rang, no voices sang, no gathering of courtiers filled the hall. History often records the deaths of rulers with solemn detail, but here there was only absence. Even the palace walls seemed to lean inward, watching in silence. At last, the weight of his own body betrayed him, struggling to lift the goblet again. His strength faltered. The silver cup slipped from his hands, rolling across the stone floor with a sharp clang. Red liquid spilled across the ground, spreading like a wound that no one could heal. For a moment the sound echoed, sharp and final, before being swallowed by silence. He fell forward, his body sinking into the bed, his face turned toward the fading light of the candles. There were no witnesses to speak his last words, no records of any prayer whispered from his lips. Death came not as a dramatic clash, but as a quiet surrender, an extinguishing flame in a room already heavy with shadows. So ended the life of Ferdinand Charles of Austria, at 34 years of age, a prince born into ceremony, leaving the world without it. No triumph, no crown, only a final moment in which the palace stood still and a single silver goblet lay on the floor, its red stain darkening against the stone. When news of Ferdinand Charles's death left Innsbruck, it carried little of the solemnity usually reserved for princes of the Habsburg line. His body was prepared for burial, wrapped in ritual and dignity, but those who watched whispered of something else. The formal processions could not silence the rumors. Across Tyrol, and soon across the empire, stories spread that the Archduke had not died as a ruler should, but as a man broken by his own excess. The funeral was marked by outward grandeur, yet its atmosphere was heavy with unease. Nobles bowed, choirs sang, but behind their solemn expressions there lingered judgment. The young Archduke had been expected to embody the continuity of the dynasty, yet instead he became its cautionary tale. His lack of heirs meant that his line ended with him, and his childless marriage only deepened the sense of futility. In a family obsessed with succession and power, his death was not merely personal tragedy, it was political embarrassment. In Vienna, courtiers spoke in hushed tones of his decline. To admit it openly would stain the dynasty's reputation, yet to deny it was impossible. Letters written at the time reveal a mixture of pity and disdain. Some described him as unfortunate, others as wasteful. The idea that a prince of such privilege could collapse into addiction reflected poorly on the very structure that had raised him. The Habsburgs, who had built their authority on discipline and ceremony, now found one of their own remembered for weakness rather than strength. Among the people, the tale spread even more vividly. Innsbruck's citizens told stories of a ruler who had squandered his health in drink, who had vanished into solitude, who had left his court in silence. These accounts grew with each retelling, becoming a legend of decline, a warning passed from one generation to another. The Archduke's name no longer evoked majesty, but the dangers of indulgence. This is how memory transformed him. Ferdinand Charles became less a man and more a symbol. His death illustrated the fragility of power when weighed against human weakness. He stood as proof that no wealth, no ceremony, no palace could shield a ruler from his own vices. For the dynasty, his story became a shadow, a reminder whispered in corridors whenever excess threatened to undo another branch of the family. For history, it became an image, the ruin of privilege, the collapse of promise, the silence of a palace where once there had been grandeur. The final picture remains haunting. A chamber lit by failing candles, a silver goblet falling from his grasp, red liquid staining the stone floor. That moment became the metaphor for his life, a vessel of power, heavy with promise, shattered by weakness, wine spreading like blood across the ground, impossible to reclaim, impossible to erase. And so his legacy endures, not in the victories of politics, but in the warning carved by his decline. The tragedy of Ferdinand Charles is not only the story of a man, but a mirror held to an empire, showing how glory can be undone from within. If his story lingers with you, it is because it forces us to confront the fragile line between greatness and ruin. Reflect on it, share it with others, and subscribe to this channel if you wish to uncover more of the forgotten tragedies that history tried to bury. Stories that remind us that behind crowns and empires were human lives, often consumed in silence.